Hello, and this is the second video of the brain. The first video goes into the anatomy and it's pretty slow paced. If you found the first video too slow paced for you, then you should be fine with this one. Or if you just wanted to skip the first video and do this one, if you end up confused with some of the anatomy, go back to the first video and review. So this blue area right here, if you can see that, this little arch of blue, that is a network of vessels that extend out into all of the ventricles. And the vessels are called the choroid plexus. And plexus just means a network or a mesh of something. So it's just all these little vessels all meshed up together, and then they branch out. These branch out into the lateral ventricles, into the third ventricle, which is inside the thalamus, which is right here where the thalamus is, and also into the fourth ventricle. They go all the way down. So that's called the choroid plexus. And all of these put together, these four structures on the top, this corpus callosum, the septum pellucidum, the fornix, and the choroid plexus, those are all kind of, they're part of the cerebrum, but they're kind of like the little hat on top of the diencephalon. So the diencephalon starts with this pink structure, the epithalamus. Now also I want to point out where the hypothalamus is down here, right below the thalamus. Here's the thalamus. I'm coloring the thalamus blue. Now the thalamus is right where the third ventricle is. So if you were to piece this and its other half of or hemisphere of the brain back together again, these two sides of the thalamus would come together and there would be a space right here and in the center, and that would be the third ventricle. So right beneath the third ventricle, right down here, as you can see, if you go through the hypothalamus a little bit, right through from the third ventricle, it empties out into this long little tube looking thing. And this long looking tube looking thing is called the Cerebral Aqueduct. The Cerebral Aqueduct. So an aqueduct, you know, is a passageway for water to go through or liquid to go through. And the same with this. And you'll see what's going on with the Cerebral Aqueduct in a minute. But it goes down here, the Cerebral Aqueduct goes all the way down here and down to this area, right in front of the cerebellum. See the cerebellum? So right in front of the cerebellum kind of dents in, and it leaves this little space in between the brainstem and the cerebellum. And that little space, I'm coloring it in purple, that little space is the fourth ventricle. So the first and second ventricle are lateral ventricles. Here, let me get and they're on either side of the septum pellucidum up here. I'm coloring yellow. The third ventricle is in the middle of the thalamus, which is right smack in the center of the brain. And then the fourth ventricle, if you follow the cerebral aqueduct down, the fourth ventricle is in front of the cerebellum behind the brainstem in this little space that's made. The cerebrum is the outside part around the diencephalon. So the cerebrum, here's the corpus callosum, and that was that big white arch structure, part of the little hat that I was talking about, and this is what connects the two hemispheres of the brain right here, the corpus callosum. And then underneath the corpus callosum, on either side of the septum pellucidum, see, here's the septum pellucidum, this thin tissue. On either side of that are the lateral ventricles. Now in this cerebrum though, before we get into the ventricles, I want to point out in the cerebrum, this is cut in half. This is a frontal section, so it's cut down the half, like this is the person's left ear, this is the person's right ear, and their face would be facing us, but it's sliced off. So if you're looking at this, you notice that the cerebrum is only the top layer of it is the gray matter, is that wrinkly gray matter. See, here's all the wrinkly gray matter. And this is just the top layer of the cerebrum. Underneath this, the gray matter, is the white matter. And that's all in here. And it looks kind of like a weird butterfly or like an ink blot test or something, the way it's spread out in the cerebrum, the white matter is. Now, so here's the gray matter, here's the white matter. Now, I said that to say this. If you look over here, this is a picture of your spinal column, like you're looking down onto your spinal column. This is white matter on the outside, see, and the gray matter is on the inside, which is the complete opposite of your brain. So your spine and your brain are opposite in that matter, and it still looks kind of like a butterfly spreading out. Now, the gray matter is gray because the neurons are bare. They're naked. The white matter is white because the myelination, or the little wrappers of fat around the axons of the neurons, make this white. So the white is actually the myelinated sheath around the neurons, around the axons of the neurons. So that's why both in the brain and the spinal column, that's the difference between the white matter and the gray matter, is the neurons in the white matter have the myelin sheath wrapped around them. Going back to the cerebrum here, the gray matter part is going to be called the cortex. And cortex means outer. So just remember, it's the very outer layer of the cerebrum, which is the gray matter. And the cortex actually is where you have conscious perception. So you have your conscious perception registers in your cortex. Here's just we're not going to go through this, but here's just a chart showing all the different areas on your cortex that are responsible for registering different sensory perceptions. Like if your heart's beating fast, you can't control your heart beating fast or not, but you can sure feel it, right? So the feeling of your heart beating fast registers in your cortex of your brain. And this is a map of all the different areas of the cortex of your brain are responsible for different things. Like we have the visual, we have the association, motor function. Let's see, down here we got the olfactory, that's your sense of smell, and so just a whole bunch of different stuff. All right, now here's another picture of the ventricles inside the whole brain. So this brain isn't sliced in half or anything. We're like looking in. It's like the brain is translucent and we're seeing inside in the middle. So here is the left lateral ventricle. As you can see, the lateral ventricles, which are the first and second ventricles, the left and right lateral ventricles are not just on one side or the other of the septum pellucidum. Like remember the septum pellucidum, that tissue I was telling you about? The tissue is right about here. And on either side of the septum pellucidum are where the lateral ventricles are. Well, the lateral ventricles are actually a lot bigger than what you see with the septum pellucidum. The lateral ventricles are this big light blue area. This is the left lateral ventricle. And then this one is behind it. This one is on the other side of the median of the brain, and that's the right. So this is the sagittal cut of the brain right here. So we're on the left side, and here's where the face would be. and here's the back. So these two big blue things in the shape of a backwards C, those are actually the first and second, the left and right lateral ventricles. And then, as you can see right beneath it, they go down through this little area right here, underneath the lateral ventricles, and it opens up into this ball, this area, right in the center here. Now, what is the structure of the brain in this area right here? See this pink stuff around it? This is an actual structure, and inside of that structure is this third ventricle. So see, this whole blue area is the third ventricle. And so this pink stuff that wraps around it, that the third ventricle is inside, is the thalamus. So the third ventricle is inside the thalamus. And so the cerebral spinal fluid will flow from the left and right ventricles through this little doorway looking thing into the third ventricle. And this doorway looking thing is the interventricular foramen. Now, foramen just means a hole. Inter means between. Ventricular just means about ventricles. So between the ventricles. So the hole between the ventricles is the interventricular foramen. So the hole between the ventricles, between the lateral ventricles into the third ventricle, is the little doorway how the cerebral spinal fluid flows from the lateral ventricles into the third ventricle. Now, if you follow to the bottom of the third ventricle goes into another passageway, and this passageway continues on in between the two lateral ventricles' tails down there. It goes all the way down here, and this passageway is the Cerebral Aqueduct, and I showed you that a little bit ago. And it goes down until, do you see in front of the cerebellum, there's this big space right here. It looks kind of like half of a diamond, or the cerebral aqueduct kind of opens up into this little half a diamond shape in front of the cerebellum. Here's the cerebellum. So this area right here is the fourth ventricle. And then the fourth ventricle flows down into the subarachnoid space around the brain and down around the spinal cord, which we'll get to that flow in a minute. Here is a picture of the ventricles also, but this is from the frontal point of view. So if we, like, this would be the guy's right ear, this would be the guy's left ear. We're looking at where his face used to be, but it was sliced off this way. So this would be the left lateral ventricle, and this would be the right lateral ventricle. And you see this up here, this little space, this little part right here that goes in between these ventricles, this is the septum pellucidum. Now, see how the lateral ventricles go through this little doorway, this little opening into the third ventricle down here? So these little doorway would be the interventricular foramen, the holes between ventricles, literally translated. And then from the third ventricle, it's going to go down the cerebral aqueduct and into the fourth ventricle, this little diamond shape. Now here's another view. I just wanted to show you this drawing of the same thing that we were just looking at, just because I wanted to show you these tips down here. These little areas, because of the cut, the way they cut this brain, or the way they drew this brain cut, these little tiny tips are the bottoms of the lateral ventricles, because the lateral ventricles start up here, but then they go around in the shape of a C, as we saw in the other pictures. And so these little tiny diamonds down here would be the bottoms of the lateral ventricles. This is a sagittal cut brain. Here's the front, and here's the back. And here is the top of the head removed. So as you can see, with this top of the brain removed, remember the blue arch that I showed you, the choroid plexus, that network of vessels right here, this little arch? We'll see when you slice off the top of the brain, you can see that this choroid plexus, this network of vessels, really spreads out. And it goes all the way out throughout the brain, and it goes into the ventricles. So see, like here would be a ventricle right here. The lateral ventricle would be right here because this is the septum pellucidum. And so a lateral ventricle would be right here, and one would be right here on either side of the septum pellucidum. And you see how the choroid plexus goes right over to it and it spreads out into it. And then you can't cut this, I don't have a picture of this brain cut open anymore, but you can go ahead and assume that the vessels also expand out, and they go into the thalamus, which is this underneath the choroid plexus. This is where I'm coloring a big circle. That's the thalamus beneath the choroid plexus, and inside the thalamus is the third ventricle. So the choroid plexus, that goes into the third ventricle. And then they don't show it in this brain, but the choroid plexus also goes down and expands into the fourth ventricle, which is right around here. Here's like the little diamond that I was showing you, because the cerebellum would be right here. Now, just to go over the flow again really quickly, the choroid plexus is right about here. It's inside. There is a ventricle. The lateral ventricles are on either side of the septum pellucidum, and actually they go around like this. But, you know, it's much bigger. But they definitely hook up right here with the septum pellucidum in between them. And then the third ventricle would be right around here. The thalamus surrounds it. So the third ventricle is inside the thalamus. It goes down the cerebral aqueduct. Here's the cerebral aqueduct right there. Cerebral aqueduct, and into the fourth ventricle, this little diamond area that I'm coloring right here in front of the cerebellum. That's the fourth ventricle. And then it leaves the fourth ventricle through what's called apertures. See, apertures. And apertures just mean openings. For the most part, I mean, basically. So don't get intimidated by the word aperture. It just means an opening. So from the fourth ventricle, the cerebrospinal fluid flows out of the fourth ventricle through apertures, and part of it goes down the spinal column, or into the spinal column, and part of it goes up in the subarachnoid space, which is this green area that surrounds the cerebellum. It surrounds the brain, the area that surrounds the brain, this whole space, all of this, and it goes around and around and around and surrounds the brain. So this entire green area, the space right around the brain tissue, is subarachnoid space. And see, it goes down here too. It goes down around the spinal column. And the spinal column, if you remember the meninges around the spinal column, it's the same thing as the meninges around the brain. So this subarachnoid space that's around the brain is the exact same thing as the subarachnoid space around the spinal column. It's continuous. So if you were teeny tiny and you were in a boat in the cerebral spinal fluid, you could just row your boat from the spinal cord, subarachnoid space into the brain without going through any tissues or anything. The subarachnoid space is continuous. So speaking of the spinal cord, I just wanted to refresh and remind you what the layers of the meningeal layers of the spinal cord were. First, there's this outside layer with this yellow in it. That's and see it's up above here too. See, it's going to be above the dura mater. The dura mater is the first layer. It's going to be above that. So above, what is above? The word for above? Epi means above. So epidural. So and above just means superficial because this is more toward the outside. So in that sense, it's above the dural. And then the dura mater is the layer that is right below the epidural space. So this would be the dural mater. And then there's a space on the other side of the dural mater. And what is that space called? The subdural space. And it's not an open space. You can't really see it. There's no real gap there. It's just a very tiny space between the layers of the dura and the arachnoid layer. So you got epidural, dura, and then subdural. And then underneath the subdural space is the arachnoid mater. So the arachnoid mater is beneath the subdural space, closer to the spinal cord or closer to the brain. And then underneath the arachnoid layer is the subarachnoid space, which I'm doing in green now. And the subarachnoid space is this big gap that surrounds the spinal column, and also there's a gap that surrounds the brain, and that's the subarachnoid space. And this subarachnoid space is where the cerebral spinal fluid flows. So like if you get an epidural, you're going to get a shot into that epidural space with all this fat in it, this yellow fat. But if you're going to get a spinal tap where they have to withdraw fluid, your spinal fluid out to test it for whatever, they're going to be sticking the needle past your epidural space. They're going to be sticking the needle all the way through to right outside your spinal column in the subarachnoid space. And then after the subarachnoid space is the meningeal layer that just covers the spinal column right there, or covers the brain, and that's just called the pia mater. Outside in, you got epidural space, and then you got the dura mater, and then you have the subdural space, and then you have the arachnoid mater, and then you have the subarachnoid space, and then you have the pia mater. When you get up to the brain, everything is continuous. Everything is exactly the same except for one thing. There is no epidural space around the brain. That's only for the spinal column. And when we go back to the picture, watch for it, you'll see the dura mater actually splits and turns into two layers. And we'll go into that in 1 second. But there's no epidural space up in the brain. So here is why there's no epidural space in the brain. Here's the dura mater. Here's the dura mater right here. And the dura mater, once it gets up to the brain, it splits into two layers. And these two layers is considered the dural layer. So if you're referring to the dural layer, you're referring to both of these layers. The one up, here's like the outside, here's the cranium, the skull. So here's the outside, is out here. So the one up against the cranium on the outside is called the periosteal cranial dura. So it's the periosteal dura. So this is one half of the dura layer. The other half of the dura layer it makes a little space, and it's backed up against the subdural space and then the arachnoid mater. So this layer of the dura, when it splits, is called the meningeal dura. But they're both the dura layer. They're just, each of them is makes up one half of the dura layer. Now, if they split and they make this little space in between them up in the brain, what the heck is the space called? Well, the space is called the sinus, the dural sinus. Or sometimes they call it the dural venous sinus, because everything that goes through the sinus will eventually deposit back into a vein. But you can just say the dural sinus and people know what you're talking about also. So this blue space that's made up by the splitting of the dura layer into two pieces is called the dural sinus. And there are several dural sinuses throughout the brain. The most important one, and the one on the outside that wraps around the brain, is called the superior sagittal sinus. But there are many more sinuses than that, and they all kind of circulate in their own network. Let's go back to the flow from the choroid plexus. See, the choroid plexus would be right here. The choroid plexus is the network of veins that comes into the third ventricle from right here. It goes into the lateral ventricles, and it also goes down into the fourth ventricles as well. What's up with the choroid plexus? So the choroid plexus has blood in it, obviously, because it's vessels. So when the choroid plexus vessels go into the ventricles, the blood is used by what's called ependymal cells to make CSF in the ventricles. So CSF is made in the ventricles, and it's made in all four of the ventricles. It just keeps adding more and more CSF as it flows along, but it's made in all four ventricles because the choroid plexus extends out to all four ventricles. So as long as the ependymal cells have access to that blood in the choroid plexus, which is in all four ventricles, it just keeps churning out CSF. From the CSF, it starts in the lateral ventricles, and then that goes through the interventricular foramen, interventricular F, foramen, which means hole, into the third ventricle, through the Cerebral Aqueduct, into the fourth ventricle, fourth V, through apertures. Here's the apertures down here. Through apertures into the subarachnoid space. Oops. Subarachnoid space. And that flows both down to the spinal column and up through the brain in the subarachnoid space. Now, how does it get from the subarachnoid space into the sinuses? Here is let me color this green. Here is the subarachnoid space around the brain and the CSF flowing through the subarachnoid space. Well, it gets up here to the top where the dura layer has split. See how the dura layer has split and it's left this space right here, this light blue space that I'm coloring red. This is the dural sinus. So what happens is these little bumps right here, these are called arachnoid because where do they come from? They come from the arachnoid layer and the arachnoid space, this green, the subarachnoid space, the green that I colored in, it comes from that space. So it's called the arachnoid villi because they're little villi that stick up. And the CSF comes through the subarachnoid space, this light green part that I colored, and it goes through the arachnoid villi that protrude up through the subdural space and into that dural sinus where I colored red. And so that's how the CSF gets into the dural sinuses. And then it travels through the sinuses, and the sinuses are all this blue, travels through to the other sinuses. There's several sinuses in the brain. Here's a close-up of what we were just talking about. Here's the arachnoid villi, and see how this is the arachnoid space, the subarachnoid space, excuse me, with this white spider web looking thing. See, subarachnoid spider web. So here's the arachnoid space, and it protrudes up through the through the arachnoid mater, through the subdural space, and into the dural sinuses. And the CSF flows up, and it comes out the tip of these villi into the dural sinuses. Now, I know we've been talking about sinuses a lot, but I just wanted to point out, in case you were unclear, that the normal nasal sinuses, that when we get a sinus headache or we get a stopped up nose and we feel sinus pressure, these are those sinuses, the nasal sinuses, and they're all up here in kind of the front of the face here. Okay, these are not the sinuses that we're talking about. It's totally different. A sinus just means cavity, so there's all sorts of different kinds of sinuses in your body. So I just wanted to make sure that you knew that these were not the sinuses we're talking about. The sinuses we're talking about are kind of like, they're larger than veins, so they're more like cavities, and they're running through the brain kind of like veins. Here's a picture of the sinuses that we are talking about. Here is here's the center of the brain, the thalamus, the third ventricle is right around here somewhere. It would go down here to the fourth ventricle down here, or fourth ventricle down here, and it would go, come down, it would get into the sagittal sinus, and from the sagittal sinus it would go into the other sinuses and flow all around the brain. But then all the sinuses come back and they all meet back here in the back in the occipital area, and you can see it says the confluence of sinuses. This is where all the sinuses meet. The CSF, the cerebral spinal fluid, all comes down, all of the sinuses, and they meet here at this area in the occipital. And from there, they go through the transverse and sigmoid vessel there, which empties into the internal jugular vein, which goes through the jugular foramen, goes into the brachiocephalic vein, or veins, one on each side, and that goes into the superior vena cava, which goes into the heart. So once again, the CSF, just the flow of your cerebral spinal fluid, you start with the choroid plexus. Plexus is blood. And they're used by ependymal cells in the ventricles to make CSF, cerebral spinal fluid. That goes from the left and right lateral ventricles through the interventricular foramen, into the third ventricle, where it picks up more CSF, because remember, CSF is manufactured in all the ventricles. Through the third ventricle, it goes through the Cerebral Aqueduct, into the fourth ventricle, through apertures, into the Subarachnoid Space, and then it seeps through the arachnoid villi into the Dural Sinuses. The Dural Sinuses all meet at the occipital, at the confluence of sinuses. The confluence just means where they all meet. And from the confluence, they deposit into the internal jugular vein, or veins, which goes into the brachiocephalic veins, which dumps into the superior vena cava and into the heart. And then it goes out to the lungs to get reoxygenated and circulates all throughout the body as part of the blood. So when it rejoins the jugular, it rejoins the blood and mixes in with the blood. And that's it.